Hi, we have come to week 6. So far, we have done a lot of exercises on how we are going to paraphrase with nouns, as well as turning conjunctions into verbs, or rather relations that has to do with purpose, possibility, and so on. And today, we're going to shift our focus on how we're going to reverse engineer and unpack complex noun groups, especially when we are reading academic texts. It's common for us to encounter these kinds of complex noun groups. So if you want to know more about the idea of complex noun groups, you may want to go back to our previous tutorials, our previous content for more information. So these are the objectives of the week. As I've just said, that we're going to learn how to unpack, or in other terms, expand the noun groups while keeping the original meanings. We are also looking at how we are going to do the summary. And I'll show you my process and I'll demonstrate once how we're going to do it. And later in the week, I'll also show you some useful keywords that you can learn and use in your week 7 summary task. If you are my students, if you are coming to my writing class, you will have to do a summary writing task in week 7. And I can't emphasize enough of this important note. When you are paraphrasing or when you are summarizing text, make sure the first things that you consider are changing grammatical structure. And by changing the parts of speech of some words, as I showed you in the previous weeks, naturally everything else in the sentence will have to change. So you are at the same time changing the sentence structures. So remember this. Then the first part of our tutorial will be decompressing. So we've got a term quite like the yoga thing. When we are so stressed, when we are so compressed in the week, it's also good that we do some decompression. In the same way, when we read dense text such as your textbooks, texts, or journal articles, you will see a lot of condensed or compressed ideas in noun groups. So it's good that we can learn the skill of how to unpack them in order to help us read the text better. Here is the first example, perhaps from a student's essay. So the full sentence contains a very long or complex noun group, which is the expanding role of economics in the social sciences in the 21st century has been described as economic imperialism. The first thing that I do would be to identify the complex noun group that appears before the main verb, which has been described, and we break it down into parts of the noun group. Okay, and at the same time, if you want to know more about the structure or the composition of noun groups, you may want to check the materials on our Moodle page. That will include some readings about how you are going to understand the structure of a noun group, as well as the other parts of a noun group. In this case, we have, again, the expanding role of economics in the social sciences in the 21st century. So we have to look at the main noun first. So the first word or the first noun that you see in the noun phrase would be role. And that would naturally be what we call the main noun or head noun. And expanding would be regarded as an adjective, okay, following the definite article the. Okay, so the expanding would be the premodifiers. Okay, those things that are used for example, classifying the head noun or giving more specific information about the head noun. And you also have the preposition phrases after the head noun role, including the first modifier of economics, and the second one in the social sciences, and third one in the 21st century. So we've got quite a complex or complicated noun phrase with two premodifiers, and we have three post modifiers. And now we can consider the options of expanding the original noun phrase back into a full sentence so that you can break the original sentence down into two shorter sentences and help you with understanding the idea of the original sentence better. So again, we have the noun group, the expanding role of economics in the social sciences in the 21st century. So in this case, when we have the prepositional phrases in the social sciences in the 21st century, they belong to the context information, the background information that talks about time, 21st century, and the field, okay, or the context, so to say, the social sciences. And then we may want to recover the verb from the noun group. For example, we can use the adjective expanding to turn it back into a verb, expands. Or in this case, because we have the ing adjective expanding in the original noun phrase, you can consider that as a continuous action. So you can say is expanding in the social sciences in the 21st century. And then all you have to do is to recover the subject of the sentence. For example, the role of economics. Or if you want to keep things shorter, you may say the economics role. That would also do. The second option would be if you look at the third table, you can see that the prepositional phrases can be moved around in the sentence quite flexibly. So perhaps you can start a sentence with the prepositional phrase about time, which is the adverbial about time in the 21st century. And then you have economics, which takes the subject position. And then you can keep using expanding role. So you have to think about the verb that would link the subject and object together. You may choose has, or maybe you can say plays. So you can say in the 21st century, comma, economics takes or plays an expanding role in the social sciences. And then remember, the sentence is not complete yet because you still have the term economic imperialism. Okay, and then you can finish the whole idea with a new sentence starting with this. Remember, this serves as a pointer summarizing everything in the previous sentence and as a way to connect your new sentence with the previous one. So you can say, this has been described as economic imperialism. Of course, you can say something like economic imperialism can be considered as the expansion of the role of economics in the social sciences in the 21st century. So what you did here is to change the adjective expanding into a noun through the process of nominalization. And then the rest of the components in the noun phrase would have to repeat in the noun phrase. It still looks different from the original sentence, but you may want to consider different options that you have before you so that you can break the idea in a more efficient way to help you read, or to simply make your writing look less dense in this case. Now, let me show you another example from another essay about organizational structure. So whatever it means, I think it's pretty straightforward with this term, organizational culture. But we have the definition here, which is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the member of one organization from another. Okay, so the target noun group would be the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one organization from another. So again, the focus of this noun phrase would be the first noun we can see in the noun phrase, which is programming. And we have the pre-modifiers, the collective. And then we have two post-modifiers in this noun group. The first one is rather straightforward with a prepositional noun phrase, a prepositional phrase of the mind. And then the second post-modifier, which would be a little bit more complex because it represents a relative clause which distinguishes the members of one organization from another, so which also embeds another complex noun group, the members of one organization from another. So in this case, you may already see that it is easier to break the nominal group or the noun group into at least two sentences or two clauses to make it a little bit more, a little bit easier to read. Here we have the noun group, the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes, and so on and so forth. And you may want to expand the noun group into two clauses, mainly because we have an embedded relative clause as post-modifier 2, modifying the whole noun phrase preceding that. Okay, so in my case, I would put it into something like minds are programmed collectively in the so that one can tell apart members of one institution from another. In this case, collective as an adjective has to be changed into an adverb. Because in the original noun group, programming as a noun is modified by an adjective collective, but in order to adjust the meaning of the verb programmed, you have to, excuse me, you have to use an adverb. And then after figuring out the main verb are programmed and the adverb collectively, you may want to recover the subject of the sentence. You can't just say are programmed collectively or programmed collectively. So what are programmed collectively? So we have the minds. You may also say it's optional. Okay, minds of workers or minds of colleagues in a company are programmed collectively. And then you may want to expand the next post modifier, so one can tell apart members from of one institution from another. And you may also add a conjunction showing that the collective programming plays a purpose in the institution, in the company, for example, to distinguish or to differentiate members of different parts of an organization. Okay, so after finishing the two sentences, the two clauses in the sentence, you can complete the whole idea by wrapping it up and mention the technical term again, organizational culture. And then you have the final sentence, this is known as organizational culture. Okay, remember the function of this is to wrap everything from the previous sentence for starting a new sentence, so that this sentence with the determiner this would connect with the previous sentence cohesively. In this slide is your turn to try, first of all, identifying the complex noun group in the sentence, having to do with the concept of doing gender. And This sentence can also be found in your activity sheet if you're in my class. So the sentence goes, doing gender involves the individual action of exerting behavior that can be classified through essential characteristics. So we have, again, quite an elaborate noun group, so which is the individual action of exerting behavior that can be classified through essential characteristics. So how are you going to break it down into a noun phrase? Tell me your answer. Similar to the previous example, we have a noun group containing a post modifier to, which is a relative clause. Okay, and this relative clause belong to the noun phrase in post modifier one. Is a little bit complex. It's a little bit complicated here, but I'm sure after some exercises you can differentiate the elements in the noun group. So you have the pre-modifiers, the individual, and the head noun action, post modifier one of exerting behavior, and the second post modifier, which is a relative clause. So you can expand the noun group into two clauses based on the understanding of how you're going to expand it using the previous example. And then you have the final sentence that this is considered as doing gender. So some extra comments on the term doing gender, which is not related to my professional knowledge, but when we consider paraphrasing the sentence or the ideas in the sentence, remember you don't have to paraphrase technical terms. Doing gender is not a casual term, but it's a specific term in your field, doing gender. Something about performing gender, okay, based on your understanding about your gender and you behave like the way you consider yourself what kind of gender you belong to. Okay, so in this case, you don't have to paraphrase doing gender. Now, here comes this week's big challenge, which comes from a short paragraph in a reading that I'm currently reading about language learning demotivation, because as a teacher, I understand that motivation of students would wane across the semester. And I'm always interested in knowing more about how, as a teacher, we can remotivate, let's say, remotivate students in the middle of semester for learning the language. As you know, English is still very important uh, for your study, and you're going to use it a lot in your study and perhaps in your future career. But I know that many of you, or even me myself, when I was a student, in the middle of a semester, the motivation for learning in general would drop. So, how are we going to rekindle your interest in the subject? So, that would be our exploration. So, if you're interested in knowing more about demotivation, you can read the book chapter that I include here in this slide. So here it is. The context of this so-called paragraph, as you remember what I said before, a paragraph is typically not a one-sentence paragraph, so it has to be a little bit longer. But in this case, as you read the author's work, you can find this sentence contains a very, very, very complex noun group. So in the previous example that I showed you, that would include basically just two post modifiers with two prepositional phrases. But look at this. To conclude, individual demotivation can often represent a collapse in resilience caused by a failure to enlist cognitive strategies to resolve the negative emotion that stem from deficits in need fulfillment. So if you just read this sentence, it is very difficult for you to decipher what it is about. So this sentence basically talks about the process or the sequence of events that would lead the learner to demotivation. Okay, so that means if you have to understand this sentence in the first place, maybe you will have to read the previous paragraphs first. But we can still do some deconstruction work. We can still break the nominal phrase or the noun group down into smaller parts so that we can have a rough understanding of what this tries to mean. And basically, when you see the verb represent, the writers try to define the technical term, which is individual demotivation, in his or her or in their own words. Okay, so we have a very elaborate noun phrase coming up. We will do this big challenge in the class, but I think it would be nice of me to give you some hints before we move on. So, in the very elaborate noun group, we can identify a few simpler noun groups, including collapse and resilience. By resilience, as I told you in the previous classes, it's about the ability, okay, or the kind of disposition that we hold to tackle challenges, to get through tough times or difficult times. Or we have a term, grit, Grit, which is quite a thing recently. So if you're interested in studies about grit, Grit, you can Google it, and there are TED talks about grit. You may want to check. And the next noun phrase would be failure to enlist cognitive strategies. It means um, people would try to get some strategies to get through hard times, but they fail. And then the third one, negative emotion. And then the last one, deficits in need fulfillment. Deficits means a lack of something. Okay, a lack of what? Means to fulfill one's needs. And in here, we talk about psychological needs. When difficulties come, how are we going to satisfy or fulfill our psychological needs to face challenges, to succeed, and so on? Okay, so here we have four ideas in the very long noun group. But then, how are we going to link them logically so that we can make sense out of the events that would lead to uh, finally the eventual loss of motivation for learning, especially learning a language. So I'll leave it to you. Think about it when you are reading this at home, as well as going over the activity sheet at home before the class. So I'll leave it to you. And then the second section we have in this tutorial would be about how are we summarizing a text, a short text, for example. So I will show you my process. So how are we going to combine the skills we have learned so far for summarizing a text? So the next example would be a very short passage I took from a random textbook, and I will show you my process and my thinking process especially. So the process of summarizing, of course, is not just writing, but how you are going to read the text in the beginning, and you would want to take notes next to the passage. Maybe you would jot some margin notes, and then you will summarize each section. If the text is in paragraphs, you summarize each paragraph first, and then decide what to keep and what not to keep. And perhaps you would want to summarize the whole text into a few sentences and look at whether you are able to order the summary statements logically, and after that you finalize the summary to polish it up, to make sure the connection among sentences are effective so that it is cohesive and logically coherent. In other words, you will first find the main ideas from the topic and concluding sentences, and you may want to take notes again, and then you will want to generalize details or example with shell nouns. Remember, you are not going to keep the specific details or examples in your summary text. And then you pay attention to the cohesion of the paragraphs or among sentences. And you use knowledge of logical relations. That is, for example, cause and effect, concession, although, however, but, adding new points in addition to showing purpose for the purpose of, and so on and so forth. And you may want to do the editing at the end of the process. Remember, don't stop in the middle of the process as you write. It's always the best, it's always ideal to go back to your writing, to leave some time at the end of your task to fix sentence structure, spelling, tense, subject-verb agreement, and so on. So here is the passage from Brown from a while ago about nutrition. I'm sure all of us are concerned about nutrition. So I'm going to read the text for you very quickly. And one more tip for you as you are summarizing the text, it's also to grasp the main idea, the key idea of the text by reading the title. So the title goes, there are no good or bad foods. Okay, so you have a rough idea of what you're going to read. People tend to classify foods as being good or bad, but such opinions oversimplify each food's potential contribution to a diet. Typically, hot dogs, ice cream, candy, bacon, french fries are my favorite, are judged to be bad, whereas vegetables, fruits, and whole grain products are given the good stamp. Unless we're talking about spoiled stew, poisoned mushrooms, or something similar. However, no food can be accurately labeled as good or bad. Ice creams can be good food for physically active normal weight individuals with high calorie need who have otherwise met their nutrient requirements by consuming nutrient-dense foods. Some people who only eat what they consider to be good foods like veggies, fruits, whole grains, and tofu may still miss the healthful diet mark due to inadequate consumption of essential fatty acids and certain vitamins and minerals. All foods can fit into a healthful diet as long as the nutrient needs are met at calorie intake levels that maintain a healthy body weight. If nutrient needs are not being met and calorie intake levels too high, then the diet likely includes too many energy-dense or empty-calorie foods. A greater intake of nutrient-dense foods would be the healthy solutions. So in the next slides, I'm going to show you my process, what I'm going to remove, what I'll paraphrase, and what I will focus on when I summarize the text. You can see the very first thing that I read in a long text like this would be taking away the examples. As I said, as I read the text, I saw that hot dogs, ice cream, candy, bacon, french fries, not necessarily there in the summary text. Maybe later on you would like to summarize them as so-called junk food, okay? And vegetables, fruits, and whole grain products, good foods. Okay, you want to take them out here for now. Ice cream, vegetables, whole grains, tofu, all removed. By removing them, you will see that what's left in the text would be the general ideas, the main ideas the authors try to put forward, and those are the things that you want to keep in your summary text. And one more thing that I would like to take out would be a sentence before the concluding sentence. We have a condition starting with if. If nutrient needs are not being met, the diet likely includes too many energy dense or empty calorie foods. So this sentence only gives one of the conditions of an unbalanced diet, for example. But we are just going to talk about that there are no good or bad food in our diet. So that would be the main message. In this case, the condition sentence would not be necessary. So I would take it out. The next step that I will do would be to identify the topic sentence and the concluding sentence for paraphrasing. So you can see my highlights in the text. And then in the text, I will also take a look at the markers that will shift the author's position or the author's stance. So we have unless and however. So it seems to me that maybe it's good to keep this idea here. Okay, especially because of the sentence or the clause after however, no food can be accurately labeled as good or bad, which is the core or the heart of this article, which resonates or echoes the title of the passage. Okay, and then I'll also add the short summary in the passage to include it and paraphrase it because it's useful. It also points out the main message of the whole passage. After identifying the main message, the main idea of the passage, by reading the topic and concluding sentences and highlighting the main ideas that would resonate with the title of the passage, now I would jot notes right next to the passage or the highlighted parts. For example, the topic sentence would become something like oversimplification of classifying foods as good or bad. And then there are exceptions like poisonous or stale foods or rotten food would, of course, be bad food. And then the third message would be paraphrased or summarized into a phrase such as nutrition in line with calorie intake requirements or matching with, align with, and so on. And then the concluding sentence would be something like when we have the word solution, perhaps we can say a recommendation for consuming foods rich in nutrients. Okay, a greater intake of nutrient-dense foods. Nutrient-dense, maybe we can paraphrase it by expanding it a little bit. Foods rich or foods that are rich in nutrients. So with the ideas identified and roughly summarized, now we look at the relations between or among these ideas. For example, the first two ideas about the exceptions such as poisonous or stale foods, which are bad, and oversimplification of classifying foods as good or bad. So the first uh, point about poisonous or stale foods would be one exception. Okay, in that we can confidently label them as bad food. Otherwise, no food is considered good or bad. And the third and fourth ideas are uh, some kind of relation, having some kind of relation that the third idea seems to be a recommendation. Okay, what the recommendation is would be the nutrition that meet or consuming nutrition that aligns with calorie intake requirements. Okay, So then we will move on to look at the overall relations among two parts of the text. And you may put it like this. You can break the whole idea down into two bigger parts. So we have the first idea about uh, classifying goods as good or bad would be some kind of an oversimplification. So what should we do instead? We have a recommendation in the later part of the passage, which is a recommendation for consuming foods that are rich in nutrients and aligning with calorie intake requirements. So we can write the passage now by putting them together in a logical manner. Here is my attempt. Except for poisonous or stale foods, which are inherently bad, to categorize foods as good or bad would be an oversimplification. Instead, consuming foods rich in nutrients in order to align with the calorie intake requirements would be one recommendation for an all-round healthy diet. So you can see this summary text is significantly shorter with no examples, with no specific details. And each part of the sentence looks very different from the original, so you don't see traces of the original text. Here you can see in particular how I paraphrased topic and concluding sentences. So you can see again, it's very different from the original sentences in the original passage. And of course, I made use of knowledge that I've learned about nominalization. So I went over the text, I went over the original sentence and looked for the word that can be nominalized. And then I also change other parts of a sentence so that it becomes a successful paraphrase. In this case, of course, I didn't include the citation, okay, which is brown, and of course you need to do it. So this is one of the things that I may have to improve in my summary text. So I have to say something like, Brown, 2011, argued that, comma, and then except for, and so on and so forth. This means when you summarize the author's stance, you have to use the language to show clearly that it is the author's stance, not your stance. Like in this paraphrased or summarized text, it seems that it belongs to my own arguments or my own comments on the topic. So the way you have to uh, improve the text would be putting the citation back in the summary text, as with what I keep telling you throughout the semester and the weeks that we spend together. Okay, so we have a comment here would be an oversimplification. Oversimplification represents the writer's comment on the topic of categorizing food simply by good or bad labels. And then one recommendation would mean some good insights, some positive solutions. When we talk about solutions, it has to be positive. Okay? And we also use some stance markers to show that the writers want to change your viewpoint about an idea of the idea of labeling food as good or bad is only partially right. And you have the phrase except for, and then you use instead in the second part of the passage to show that what comes after uh, the marker instead would be an updated view because the author's view is considered better. Okay, that means consuming foods or eating foods that are rich in nutrients is actually a better idea rather than simply considering foods as good or bad. Okay, so this is how you're going to summarize the author's stance. But don't forget to add the citation back in to the summary. Before I wrap up, based on the big challenge that I gave to you and the demonstration that I have just showed you in summarizing the text, the take-home message of this lesson is that paraphrasing is not just about our vocabulary, the size of our vocabulary in particular. Of course, you need to know how to find synonyms or how you are going to find the shell nouns for paraphrasing your ideas or summarizing your ideas, as well as how you are going to convert verbs, adjectives into nouns, or turning conjunctions into nouns or verbs. But paraphrasing is also about how we understand the logical links among sentences and phrases, so we can identify those ideas in terms of nouns and verbs. But when we paraphrase them, when we summarize them, we have to consider how these elements of the original text can be logically linked together as a coherent whole. That also applies to your writing. I'm sure you know a lot about your field in terms of the technical terms, what kind of anxiety, what kind of disorder, and so on and so forth. But how are you going to link these terms with, for example, verbs? So what comes with disorder, like suffer from, and so on and so forth? Or what comes with the term demotivation? Is that taking place or takes place? So you have to observe your textbooks, your journal articles to look for these patterns. We call that these patterns collocational patterns, and how you are linking logical patterns. So that's all from me for this week. So when we meet again in week 7, before we have the in-class take-home assessment, we will have to wrap up with the ideas of citations and quotations. These are straightforward stuff, but how you are going to report uh, the sources, report the references through citation and quotations would also have a lot to do with the coherence of the passage or the strength of the voice of the passage of the author's arguments. So you have to balance uh, your ideas in your own words, the paraphrase ideas in your own words, as well as voices from the authors. So I'll talk about some do's and don'ts before I let you do the task, okay? Which is a timed assessment, a 90-minute reading and writing task. Okay, so that's all from me. So take care, and I'll see you in the class soon.